I realized I had to act. Staying in the tent meant I was a sitting target. I opened the flap slowly, trying to make myself look as large and intimidating as possible, holding the flashlight in one hand and the bear spray in the other. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure it would give me away. The beam of the flashlight caught a figure moving between the trees. At first, I thought it was an animal, but the movement was too deliberate, too human-like. My stomach dropped. Someone was out there. I remembered reading about the importance of not panicking. I needed to create distance. I grabbed my backpack, throwing it toward the lake as a distraction, and ran toward the water. My feet slipped on the damp ground, and I fell, scraping my hands and knees. I scrambled up, breathing heavily, and kept running along the shoreline. The figure followed, stepping carefully, not running but keeping pace, staying in the shadows. I looked for a place to hide, but there was none, just trees and thick underbrush. I had no choice but to keep moving, hoping to find a road or trail. I followed the lake's edge for what felt like an eternity, my legs burning, my arms scratched from branches. The moon was rising, casting dim light across the water, but it wasn't enough to see clearly. I remembered the compass in my pocket. If I kept moving east, there should be a logging road marked on the map. I focused on that, using the compass to guide me. The sound behind me never stopped. Deliberate, careful steps, keeping pace. Finally, after hours of crawling through underbrush, tripping over roots, and barely able to breathe, I saw the faint glimmer of headlights in the distance. My heart leapt. Someone else. People. Safety. I ran toward it, waving my arms, screaming at the top of my lungs. The vehicle stopped, and a man got out. He looked confused at first, then alarmed when he saw me. I collapsed near the edge of the road, gasping for air, pointing behind me. The figure was nowhere in sight. The man helped me into his truck and drove me to the nearest ranger station. I reported everything, gave a description of the person I had seen, and the rangers promised to check the area. They told me I had been incredibly lucky. Whoever it was had been stalking the trail for some time, waiting for campers who ventured alone. I was in shock, exhausted, my body covered in scratches, bruises, and dirt. I realized just how dangerous it had been to go alone, in a place so isolated. The next morning, after some rest, I returned to the forest with the rangers to point out the exact spot where I had been camping. They found evidence of someone moving through the area recently. Footprints, broken branches, and discarded items hidden near the trees. It was clear I had narrowly escaped a very real threat. I felt shaken, but also relieved that I had survived and that someone else had been there to help. I learned a harsh lesson about the reality of isolation in the wild, the unpredictability of other humans, and the importance of always letting someone know where you are going. When I finally left that forest, I felt a mix of gratitude and lingering fear. The city, which I had once felt trapped in, now seemed safer, almost comforting. I still think about that night sometimes, how close I came to something I can barely imagine. It changed me, made me more cautious, more aware of the world around me, and more grateful for the ordinary safety most people take for granted. The memory of the lake, the cold night, and the footsteps circling my tent is something that will stay with me forever. A reminder of just how fragile human life can be when faced with the unknown. I had always thought I knew the wilderness. I had grown up with a few short camping trips here and there with my family, and as I got older, I started going on longer solo trips, always searching for that sense of peace that only complete isolation could bring. That summer, I decided to challenge myself with a solo camping trip deep in a national forest that had been mostly untouched for decades. It was a place I had researched extensively, poring over topographic maps, studying satellite images, reading reports of other hikers' experiences, and noting any potential hazards. I felt prepared. I told myself I was prepared. I packed my gear with care. I had a tent, sleeping bag, stove, food for a week, water purification tablets, first aid supplies, a compass, GPS, and extra batteries. I made sure to bring a decent knife and a small hatchet just in case. I even brought a flare, though I knew it was unlikely I'd ever need it. My backpack was heavy but manageable. As I drove to the trailhead in the early morning, the sun had not yet fully risen. casting a dull light over the trees, and I felt that familiar mix of excitement and apprehension. The trail started easy enough. It was wide, relatively clear, and the forest was lush with the green of late summer. Birds sang intermittently, though the deeper I went, the less I heard them. The further I hiked, the quieter it became. By noon, I had put in nearly 10 miles. I found a small clearing by a creek where I decided to rest and eat lunch. The water was clear and cold, and the sound of it running over stones was soothing. I refilled my water bottle, checked my map, and tried to relax. I reminded myself that the further I went from marked trails, the more I could truly experience the forest alone. After lunch, I left the clearing and took a less traveled side trail. The path became narrower, overgrown, and less defined. I had to push through branches, step over fallen logs, and navigate patches of slippery moss. I noticed how the forest seemed older here, the trees taller, the ground softer with layers of pine needles and decomposing leaves. Shadows stretched longer as the sun moved west. I felt a thrill in the solitude. No other humans were around, and I could hear only the small noises of nature, the rustling of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig, the distant call of a hawk. By late afternoon, I began scouting a place to set up camp for the night. I wanted somewhere safe but secluded, near water but not too close. Eventually, I found a small ridge overlooking a shallow valley. The ground was relatively flat, and the spot was sheltered from the wind by thick pines. I cleared an area for my tent, making sure to remove sticks and rocks. I built a small fire pit with stones I gathered, careful to place it a safe distance from the tent. The forest had a damp smell, the earthy scent mixed with pine resin, and I found it comforting. I set up my tent, arranged my sleeping bag, and unpacked a few supplies. The sun was nearly gone by the time I finished setting up camp. I lit a small fire and started cooking a simple meal of rice and canned beans. The flames crackled and threw shadows across the surrounding trees. I ate slowly, enjoying the warmth of the fire. By the time I was done, darkness had fallen completely. The forest transformed. Every sound seemed sharper, the rustle of small animals, the creak of tree branches, the occasional drip of water from leaves above. I sat quietly, listening, alert but not panicked. Then I heard it, a snapping sound. It was faint but deliberate, not the random break of a branch under its own weight. I froze, straining my ears. There it was again, a distinct crack, followed by another. Something or someone was moving deliberately through the underbrush. I looked around, scanning the shadows, but saw nothing. My heart started to beat faster, but I told myself it was probably a deer, a raccoon, or some other forest animal. Still, I took out my knife and kept it nearby. I didn't want to be careless. Over the next hour, the sounds came closer. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, and occasional branches bending under weight. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, but the pattern felt different, too precise, too methodical. It didn't wander. It seemed to be following me. I tightened the drawstring on my tent and positioned my knife within reach. My fire had dwindled down to embers, but I added some logs, keeping it alive. Shadows danced around the clearing, and I could swear I saw movement at the edge of the firelight. Hours passed. I stayed awake, alert, my senses sharp. Every sound made me tense. I reminded myself to breathe, to stay calm. I tried to reason through the situation. If it was another hiker, maybe they were lost. Maybe they would turn away if they saw my fire. But my gut told me it wasn't another camper. The area I had chosen was too secluded. No marked trails were nearby. Whoever it was, they had come off trail intentionally. Around midnight, the movements became more pronounced. I could hear deliberate steps circling my campsite, soft but careful. Occasionally, a stick would snap under heavier pressure. My fire had burned down to a thin line of embers, providing almost no light. I tried to remain as still and quiet as possible, listening. My mind raced through worst-case scenarios. I could stay in the tent and hope they left. I could try to scare them off with a yell or by banging sticks together. but that might provoke them. I considered hiking out in the dark, but the terrain was rough, and it was dangerous to move without visibility. I stayed put, huddled close to my sleeping bag, clutching my knife. Time stretched. I don't know how long I stayed awake like that, but eventually, exhaustion overcame fear. My fire had burned out completely, and I was shivering from the cold. I could still hear faint movements, but they were slower now. I drifted into a light, uneasy sleep, waking every few minutes to listen. At dawn, I awoke to complete silence. No snapping twigs, no rustling leaves. My tent was intact, nothing disturbed. I cautiously unzipped it and peeked outside. The forest was bathed in soft light, the mist lifting from the valley below. I scanned the perimeter of my camp. Nothing. No footprints, no signs of anyone. I exhaled, relieved but shaken. The night had felt like an eternity, but I had survived without confrontation. I quickly packed my gear and decided to move closer to a known trail, choosing not to stay in the secluded area any longer. I hiked with vigilance, constantly scanning my surroundings. Every sound made me flinch, but I forced myself to stay calm. By late morning, I reached a familiar junction and recognized the markers that led back toward the main trailhead. Relief washed over me. I wasn't entirely sure what had followed me the night before, but I was grateful that nothing had escalated into violence. I reached my car in the late afternoon, exhausted and mentally drained. I double-checked that all my gear was intact and loaded everything back inside. Sitting in the driver's seat, I allowed myself to reflect. The forest, while beautiful and serene in daylight, held dangers I hadn't fully appreciated. Isolation brought vulnerability, and even with preparation, unexpected threats, human or animal, could appear. I drove home slowly, stopping a few times to rest. By evening, I was back in familiar surroundings, safe and exhausted. I unpacked my gear, cleaned my equipment, and documented the experience in my journal. I included every detail: the trail, the campsite, the sounds, the fear, and the relief. That night, I slept deeply, the comfort of walls and a locked door around me washing away the tension of the past 2 days. Reflecting on the trip later, I understood that what made it frightening was not the unknown, but the realization of how vulnerable I truly was when completely alone. The forest was indifferent. It didn't care about me. I had survived not because the wilderness had spared me, but because I had stayed vigilant, cautious, and calm in the face of fear. That awareness would forever change the way I approached the outdoors. I would return to the forest, but with a deeper respect and an even greater preparation. The fear I felt that night stayed with me, but it was tempered by the satisfaction of having endured, and that sense of hard-earned survival became a story I would carry for the rest of my life. I had been planning this trip for months, ever since I realized I needed a break from the constant noise and stress of the city. I wanted something raw, something that would push me out of my comfort zone. I had been camping a few times before, but always with friends, always in places with other people around, where there was some sense of safety in numbers. This time, I wanted to go alone. I found a trail that led deep into the forest, far from any roads or clearings, a place where the trees grew thick and the underbrush was dense. According to the map, there was a small lake about 12 miles in, and I planned to camp near the shore. I left early in the morning, carrying my backpack that was heavier than I expected. Inside, I had the essentials: a tent, sleeping bag, a small stove, food for 3 days, a first aid kit, a flashlight, extra batteries, and a compass. I had read survival guides and watched videos about hiking and camping, so I knew the basics. Still, as I started down the narrow trail, the quiet of the forest hit me immediately. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves under my boots, the occasional snap of a twig, and the soft rustle of wind through the trees. Birds chirped sporadically, but even they seemed cautious. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. By mid-afternoon, I had covered about 6 miles. I stopped at a small clearing to rest, sitting on a fallen log, wiping sweat from my forehead. I ate some trail mix and drank water from my bottle, feeling a sense of satisfaction. The trail was challenging, with thick roots and rocks, and I was glad I had chosen sturdy boots. I checked the map and compass. I was still on track. The lake was supposed to be a few miles ahead. I packed up and started again, feeling a strange mixture of excitement and unease. Around 4 in the afternoon, the trail narrowed even further. The trees were so close together that sunlight barely penetrated the canopy. Shadows stretched across the ground in strange shapes. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. I tried to shake it off as imagination. I focused on each step, careful not to trip over roots. Then I heard it, a rustling in the underbrush to my right. I froze. My heart started beating faster. The sound didn't continue steadily. It was sporadic, like something moving cautiously, trying not to be noticed. I waited, holding my breath, but nothing else happened. After a few tense moments, I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal, and I continued walking, though my steps were quicker now. As I approached the lake, the terrain flattened out slightly, and I could hear the faint sound of water lapping against the shore. Relief washed over me. I needed to set up camp before nightfall. I found a flat spot not too far from the water, with some clearance from the trees. I set up my tent, hammered in the stakes, and unrolled my sleeping bag. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees, casting a dim, orange light across the lake. I decided to explore the area a bit, scouting for firewood and a safe spot to cook. The forest felt dense and watchful. Every rustle of leaves or crack of a branch made me jump. I gathered dry sticks and branches, arranging them into a small pile for the fire. I used my lighter and soon I had a small flame going. The warmth and light were comforting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I told myself I was imagining things. The lake was quiet, the water reflecting the darkening sky. I ate some food, trying to enjoy the peacefulness. Night was falling fast, and I retreated to my tent. I closed the flap, zipped it up completely, and lay on my sleeping bag. I listened to the sounds outside. The occasional rustle of leaves, the croak of frogs, the splash of fish jumping in the lake. Nothing seemed threatening, yet I couldn't shake the unease in my stomach. Around midnight, I woke to a noise. At first, I thought it was my imagination, a product of being alone in the dark. Then I heard it again, a distinct snapping of twigs, coming from just beyond the small clearing where my tent was pitched. My heart raced. I stayed perfectly still, straining to hear. The sound was deliberate, slow, like someone walking carefully through the underbrush. Panic started to creep in. I reached for my flashlight, switching it on and pointing it toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. The noise stopped immediately. I held my breath, listening, but everything went silent. I tried to calm myself, convincing myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But something about the way the branches had snapped didn't feel natural. Animals tend to move quickly and flee. This was deliberate, slow, cautious. I stayed in my sleeping bag, tense, gripping the flashlight. Minutes stretched into an hour. Eventually, exhaustion won over fear, and I drifted into a light, uneasy sleep. Sometime later, I don't know how long, I woke to a noise right outside the tent. Something was moving close to the tent, dragging, or maybe sliding across the ground. I could hear the crunch of small rocks and twigs, the brushing of leaves. My body froze. I thought about grabbing the small knife I had, but I was afraid of making a noise. Then I remembered the small bear spray I had packed. My hands shook as I fumbled to get it. The noise paused, then shifted, moving slowly around the tent, circling. Whoever or whatever it was very careful. I had always thought I knew the wilderness. I had grown up with a few short camping trips here and there with my family, and as I got older, I started going on longer solo trips, always searching for that sense of peace that only complete isolation could bring. That summer, I decided to challenge myself with a solo camping trip deep in a national forest that had been mostly untouched for decades. It was a place I had researched extensively, poring over topographic maps, studying satellite images, reading reports of other hikers' experiences, and noting any potential hazards. I felt prepared. I told myself I was prepared, I packed my gear with care. I had a tent, sleeping bag, stove, food for a week, water purification tablets, first aid supplies, a compass, GPS, and extra batteries. I made sure to bring a decent knife and a small hatchet just in case. I even brought a flare, though I knew it was unlikely I'd ever need it. My backpack was heavy but manageable. As I drove to the trailhead in the early morning, the sun had not yet fully risen, casting a dull light over the trees, and I felt that familiar mix of excitement and apprehension. The trail started easy enough. It was wide, relatively clear, and the forest was lush with the green of late summer. Birds sang intermittently, though the deeper I went, the less I heard them. The further I hiked, the quieter it became. By noon, I had put in nearly 10 miles. I found a small clearing by a creek where I decided to rest and eat lunch. The water was clear and cold, and the sound of it running over stones was soothing. I refilled my water bottle, checked my map, and tried to relax. I reminded myself that the further I went from marked trails, the more I could truly experience the forest alone. After lunch, I left the clearing and took a less traveled side trail. The path became narrower, overgrown, and less defined. I had to push through branches, step over fallen logs, and navigate patches of slippery moss. I noticed how the forest seemed older here, the trees taller, the ground softer with layers of pine needles and decomposing leaves. Shadows stretched longer as the sun moved west. I felt a thrill in the solitude. No other humans were around, and I could hear only the small noises of nature, the rustling of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig, the distant call of a hawk. By late afternoon, I began scouting a place to set up camp for the night. I wanted somewhere safe but secluded, near water but not too close. Eventually, I found a small ridge overlooking a shallow valley. The ground was relatively flat, and the spot was sheltered from the wind by thick pines. I cleared an area for my tent, making sure to remove sticks and rocks. I built a small fire pit with stones I gathered, careful to place it a safe distance from the tent. The forest had a damp smell, the earthy scent mixed with pine resin, and I found it comforting. I set up my tent, arranged my sleeping bag, and unpacked a few supplies. The sun was nearly gone by the time I finished setting up camp. I lit a small fire and started cooking a simple meal of rice and canned beans. The flames crackled and threw shadows across the surrounding trees. I ate slowly, enjoying the warmth of the fire. By the time I was done, darkness had fallen completely. The forest transformed. Every sound seemed sharper, the rustle of small animals, the creak of tree branches, the occasional drip of water from leaves above. I sat quietly, listening, alert but not panicked. Then I heard it, a snapping sound. It was faint but deliberate, not the random break of a branch under its own weight. I froze, straining my ears. There it was again, a distinct crack, followed by another. Something or someone was moving deliberately through the underbrush. I looked around, scanning the shadows, but saw nothing. My heart started to beat faster, but I told myself it was probably a deer, a raccoon, or some other forest animal. Still, I took out my knife and kept it nearby. I didn't want to be careless. Over the next hour, the sounds came closer. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, and occasional branches bending under weight. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, but the pattern felt different. Too precise, too methodical. It didn't wander. It seemed to be following me. I tightened the drawstring on my tent and positioned my knife within reach. My fire had dwindled down to embers, but I added some logs, keeping it alive. Shadows danced around the clearing, and I could swear I saw movement at the edge of the firelight. I had been planning the camping trip for months. I wanted to get far away from everything, from the noise, from the city, from people. I found a spot deep in the woods, a place that few people visited, near a river that cut through the forest. The idea was to hike in, set up camp, fish a little, and just exist in the quiet of the woods. I was used to camping, but this trip was meant to be solo. I needed that kind of isolation. I packed my backpack carefully. A tent, sleeping bag, food for 3 days, water, a small first aid kit, a lantern, extra batteries, a knife, some matches, a cooking stove, and a small fishing kit. I made sure I had everything. I didn't want to rely on anyone. I left early in the morning, when the sun was just starting to rise. The drive to the trailhead took a few hours. My car was parked under the sparse shadow of the trees, and I could see the trail winding ahead, disappearing into thick green. I took a deep breath, checked my gear, and started walking. The forest was quiet at first, just the sound of my boots against the dirt trail and the occasional bird. The trail was narrow, mostly dirt with roots jutting out, and the air smelled of damp earth and pine. I followed it for hours, enjoying the quiet, the calm, feeling like I was leaving the world behind. As I walked, I noticed the subtle changes in the forest. The trees grew denser, the canopy higher, so little sunlight broke through. Moss and ferns carpeted the ground, and every now and then, a deer or a rabbit would dart across the trail. I moved slowly, careful not to startle anything. By late afternoon, I reached the river. It was narrower than I expected, maybe 10 feet across, but the current was strong and fast. The water was cold and clear, running over smooth stones. I followed it for a bit, searching for a suitable place to set up camp. Eventually, I found a small clearing, flat enough for my tent, with enough dry wood nearby for a fire. It was perfect. I set up the tent, laid out my sleeping bag, and unpacked a few supplies. I felt a sense of satisfaction, the way I always did when I had built a small home in the middle of the wilderness. I decided to fish. I waded into the shallow water, casting my line upstream. I had caught fish before, so I knew what I was doing. The sun was lowering, casting long shadows through the trees, and the water sparkled in streaks of gold and orange. After a while, I caught a small trout. Not much for dinner, but it would do. I made a small fire, cooked the fish, and ate slowly, savoring the taste of the wilderness, the fresh air, and the quiet. As darkness fell, I was grateful for the lantern. The forest changed completely after the sun went down. Shadows moved with the wind, and every sound seemed louder. The rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig, the distant splash of water. I kept the fire going, knowing it would keep animals away, or at least make me feel safer. I lay in my sleeping bag for a while, listening. The sound of the river was soothing, but there was also something tense in the night air, a sense of being watched. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination. I didn't sleep well. I woke several times to strange noises. Snaps in the underbrush, the crunch of leaves, heavy breathing that wasn't mine. Once, I thought I saw a shadow move just beyond the reach of the firelight. I froze, heart pounding, staring into the darkness. I told myself it was a deer or some other animal, but even as I thought that, a small voice of unease whispered that it wasn't. The next morning, I woke early, determined to keep my plan. I packed some gear and started exploring upstream along the river. The forest was still dense, and the river cut through steep banks in places. I climbed over rocks, waded through shallow parts of the water, careful not to slip. Around midday, I noticed something unusual. Footprints. Large footprints, not human. They were too big for me, too big for any animal I knew. The shape was odd, almost human-like, but not quite. I followed them cautiously. They went off the trail and into a thicker part of the forest. I felt a twinge of fear but also curiosity. As I followed, the footprints became clearer, and I noticed signs of recent activity. Broken branches, flattened grass, and small piles of debris. Something had been moving here recently, and it wasn't normal wildlife. I stopped for a long time, considering turning back. But I was deep in the forest now. If I went back, I would have to retrace my steps, and I didn't know if it was safe. I decided to keep moving carefully, paying attention to everything. I had been planning this camping trip for months. My goal was simple: escape the city, disconnect, and spend a few nights alone in the forest. I packed carefully, making sure I had all the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, first aid kit, a map, compass, flashlight, extra batteries, a knife, and even a small stove. I had chosen a remote area I had read about online, a stretch of forest far from any main roads, with a river that ran through it and a few old hiking trails that weren't well traveled. Sounded perfect. The drive there was long but peaceful. I passed through winding mountain roads, surrounded by thick trees and steep cliffs. The air grew cooler as I gained elevation. By the time I reached the trailhead, it was late afternoon. The sun hung low, casting long shadows across the gravel parking lot. I parked my car, checked my backpack one last time, and began hiking into the woods. The trail was narrow and uneven, littered with rocks and fallen branches. I had been here only a few minutes when I realized how quiet it was. No birds, no cars, no other hikers, just the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. I hiked for a couple of hours, making good progress, and eventually found a clearing near the river. The spot seemed ideal. Flat ground for my tent, firewood scattered nearby, and the river not too far away. I set up my tent carefully, making sure it was secure and waterproof. The sun was setting when I finished, and the forest was bathed in an orange and pink glow. I gathered some firewood and started a small fire. The warmth and crackling sound brought a sense of comfort, and I prepared a simple meal of rice and canned vegetables. By the time I ate, darkness had fallen completely. I sat by the fire, listening to the sounds of the forest. The river gurgled nearby, leaves rustled in the wind, and occasionally a branch snapped far off in the distance. I felt a strange mix of peace and unease. Being alone in the forest was freeing, but there was also a vulnerability that came with it. I made sure my knife was within reach and that my flashlight was on the ground beside me. Night deepened. The fire died down to embers, and I crawled into my sleeping bag. The sounds of the forest continued, louder in the quiet darkness. Somewhere down the river, water splashed over rocks, echoing faintly. A breeze moved through the trees, making them sway and groan. I tried to sleep, but it was difficult. Every small noise felt amplified in the stillness. Around midnight, I woke to a rustling sound outside the tent. My heart jumped. I froze, listening. The sound came from the direction of the river, slow and deliberate, like something large moving through underbrush. My first thought was a deer or maybe a raccoon, but the pattern of movement didn't match any animal I knew. It wasn't random. It seemed deliberate, slow, and cautious. I stayed still, gripping my flashlight. I didn't want to make noise, but my mind raced through the possibilities. Wild animal, another person, some accident waiting to happen. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. Then the rustling stopped. I waited longer, straining to hear anything else, but the forest fell silent again. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was probably just an animal. Still, sleep eluded me. Every creak of the tent, every distant snap of a branch kept me tense. Eventually, exhaustion overcame fear, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. I woke again before dawn, my body stiff from sleeping on the ground. The forest was dimly lit by the first light of morning. I got out of the tent and checked my surroundings. Nothing had changed. The fire had died completely overnight, and the air was damp with dew. I ate a small breakfast, packed a little firewood for later, and decided to explore the area around the clearing. As I walked along the river, I noticed something unusual. There were footprints in the mud, large and deep, not human, but not quite like a deer or bear either. My pulse quickened. I traced them carefully. They led away from the river and into the thicker forest. I didn't want to follow them too far, but I made a mental note of the direction. They seemed fresh, and the idea that something unknown might be nearby made me uneasy. I returned to my tent, deciding to stay close for the rest of the morning. Around midday, the weather changed. Dark clouds rolled in quickly, and a sudden chill filled the air. Rain began to fall, lightly at first, then heavier. I covered my supplies and double-checked the tent. The rain was relentless, and soon the river started to rise, making the area slightly swampy. I stayed inside the tent, trying to read a map and plan the next steps. I knew that staying put during heavy rain was safer than trying to move, but the rising water and constant storm noise made the forest feel menacing. By evening, the rain slowed, leaving everything soaked and muddy. I ventured outside to gather firewood, but it was difficult. Everything was wet, and the firewood wouldn't catch easily. I finally managed to get a small fire going, enough to boil some water for food. I ate quickly, my mind restless, thinking about the footprints and the rustling from the night before. Something about this place felt off. Night fell again. The forest was darker now, the storm leaving shadows and slick leaves everywhere. I climbed into my tent with my flashlight ready. The wind had picked up, shaking the trees and whistling through the branches. Around midnight, I woke to a loud snap nearby. It was too heavy to be just a branch breaking. I sat up, flashlight in hand. The sound came from the direction of the river again. This time, I heard movement. Slow, deliberate, crunching through leaves. I realized I wasn't imagining things. There was something there, something big. I stayed perfectly still, trying to hear it. I knew the tent wouldn't stop a determined animal, and I remembered the footprints from earlier. They were too big to be a human, but I couldn't identify the animal. Fear surged through me. I thought of leaving quietly, but the river and mud made any movement noisy. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios, each one more terrifying than the last. Hours passed, and the movement never came closer. I stayed at the edge of my clearing, circling, waiting. I couldn't see it, but I could hear the weight and rhythm of it. I tried to stay calm, thinking about ways to survive if it attacked. Grab the knife, keep my back to the tent flap, make noise to scare it away. But none of it was guaranteed to work. Finally, just before dawn, the sound stopped. The forest fell silent, and I didn't dare move for another half hour. When I finally peeked outside, there was nothing. The footprints were gone. Whatever it had been, it left. I didn't sleep much after that, but I stayed alert, making sure I was ready if it returned. Morning brought a cautious sense of relief. The forest looked ordinary in daylight, but I knew what had been out there the night before. I packed up quickly, leaving the clearing and heading back toward the trailhead. Every step was careful, every noise examined. I kept my knife ready and my eyes scanning constantly. By midday, I reached the parking lot. My car felt like a safe haven. I loaded my backpack, double-checked the doors, and started the engine. The drive back to civilization was long, and I couldn't stop replaying the nights in the forest in my mind. I kept thinking about what I had seen or hadn't seen, and realized that the forest, though beautiful, could be dangerous in ways I wasn't prepared for. It wasn't monsters or ghosts, just nature itself and whatever lived in it. By the time I reached my apartment, I was exhausted, sore, and still shaken, but alive. I knew I would go camping again, but I also knew I would never underestimate the wilderness. By late afternoon, I reached a small clearing. First, I thought I was safe. Then I noticed it, a rough shelter made from branches, leaves, and tarps. It looked temporary but used. I didn't see anyone, but the ground around it had footprints leading in and out. There were scraps of food, a half-broken water bottle, and a small, empty backpack. My stomach turned. Someone was living here, in the middle of nowhere. I turned to leave, but as I did, I heard a sound. A low, guttural noise coming from the trees. I froze. My heart was pounding. I thought maybe it was an animal, a bear, or a wolf, but something about it was different. Heavy footsteps approached. I could hear them moving fast, breaking twigs under weight. I didn't wait. I ran. I ran hard, not caring about the trail anymore, following the river back the way I came. My heart was in my throat, and every shadow seemed to move toward me. I didn't look back, not even once. I ran through thick brush, stumbling, scraping my legs, my hands catching on branches. The river was a guide, and I used it to navigate. Eventually, the river widened, and I saw the clearing where I had set up camp. Relief washed over me, but I didn't stop. I grabbed my pack, shoved my things into it, and ran again, now along the trail toward the car. As night fell, I realized I wasn't sure exactly where I was. The trail had twisted, and I had lost landmarks in my panic. I relied on the sound of the river, hoping it would lead me back to the starting point. I moved slowly now, alert, scanning the shadows. Every sound made me jump. I wasn't thinking about fishing or camping anymore. I was thinking about safety, about leaving this place as fast as possible. Hours passed. My legs ached. My body screamed for rest, but I couldn't stop. Eventually, I saw the faint glow of headlights in the distance. My car. I ran toward it, tripping several times but getting up each time. When I reached it, I threw my pack into the back seat, slammed the door, and locked it. I didn't even sit down. I started the engine and drove off as fast as I could, my heart still racing. I stopped a few miles down the road to breathe. The adrenaline was fading, leaving exhaustion and a deep sense of relief. I realized I had been lucky. What I had seen out there, those footprints, the shelter, the sounds, I had no clear idea what it was, but it was dangerous. It wasn't something I could fight or reason with. It was survival. By the time I reached a gas station, I had calmed enough to collect my thoughts. I reported what I had seen to the local ranger station, describing the shelter and the signs of someone living illegally in the forest. They promised to investigate. I drove home, exhausted, every sense still on edge, but I felt safe again in the world of streets, lights, and other people. After that trip, I never went that far into the woods alone again. I still camped, but always in populated areas near official campsites with other people around. I didn't want to experience that feeling of being hunted or watched again. The memory of that night stayed with me. The footprints, the noises, the feeling of being so small in the middle of the forest, facing something I could neither understand nor fight. But it also taught me caution, preparation, and the importance of respecting the unknown. In the end, I made it out safe, but the lesson stayed. The forest isn't always peaceful. Sometimes, the real danger isn't the wildlife or the weather. It's other humans and the unknown people who live there in secret, unseen, watching. I survived because I stayed alert, moved fast, and never hesitated when I needed to. And that, more than anything, made me respect the wilderness in a new way. Around midday, the weather changed. Dark clouds rolled in quickly, and a sudden chill filled the air. Rain began to fall, lightly at first, then heavier. I covered my supplies and double-checked the tent. The rain was relentless, and soon the river started to rise, making the area slightly swampy. I stayed inside the tent, trying to read a map and plan the next steps. I knew that staying put during heavy rain was safer than trying to move, but the rising water and constant storm noise made the forest feel menacing. By evening, the rain slowed, leaving everything soaked and muddy. I ventured outside to gather firewood, but it was difficult. Everything was wet, and the firewood wouldn't catch easily. I finally managed to get a small fire going, enough to boil some water for food. I ate quickly, my mind restless, thinking about the footprints and the rustling from the night before. Something about this place felt off. Night fell again. The forest was darker now, the storm leaving shadows and slick leaves everywhere. I climbed into my tent with my flashlight ready. The wind had picked up, shaking the trees and whistling through the branches. Around midnight, I woke to a loud snap nearby. It was too heavy to be just a branch breaking. I sat up, flashlight in hand. The sound came from the direction of the river again. This time, I heard movement. Slow, deliberate, crunching through leaves. I realized I wasn't imagining things. There was something there, something big. I stayed perfectly still, trying to hear it. I knew the tent wouldn't stop a determined animal, and I remembered the footprints from earlier. They were too big to be a human, but I couldn't identify the animal. Fear surged through me. I thought of leaving quietly, but the river and mud made any movement noisy. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios, each one more terrifying than the last. Hours passed, and the movement never came closer. I stayed at the edge of my clearing, circling, waiting. I couldn't see it, but I could hear the weight and rhythm of it. I tried to stay calm, thinking about ways to survive if it attacked. Grab the knife, keep my back to the tent flap, make noise to scare it away. But none of it was guaranteed to work. Finally, just before dawn, the sound stopped. The forest fell silent, and I didn't dare move for another half hour. When I finally peeked outside, There was nothing. The footprints were gone. Whatever it had been, it left. I didn't sleep much after that, but I stayed alert, making sure I was ready if it returned. Morning brought a cautious sense of relief. The forest looked ordinary in daylight, but I knew what had been out there the night before. I packed up quickly, leaving the clearing and heading back toward the trailhead. Every step was careful, every noise examined. I kept my knife ready and my eyes scanning constantly. By midday, I reached the parking lot. My car felt like a safe haven. I loaded my backpack, double-checked the doors, and started the engine. The drive back to civilization was long, and I couldn't stop replaying the nights in the forest in my mind. I kept thinking about what I had seen or hadn't seen, and realized that the forest, though beautiful, could be dangerous in ways I wasn't prepared for. It wasn't monsters or ghosts, just nature itself and whatever lived in it. By the time I reached my apartment, I was exhausted, sore, and still shaken, but alive. I knew I would go camping again, but I also knew I would never underestimate the wilderness. I never thought a simple camping trip would turn into one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. I had planned it for weeks, making sure I had everything. The tent, the sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, a small stove, extra batteries, and a first aid kit. The weather report said clear skies, and I was excited to get away from the noise of the city. I had chosen a small forested area in the mountains, a place I had never been before but had read about online. The pictures showed tall pines, a small lake, and winding trails. Everything seemed perfect. The drive there was long, winding through narrow mountain roads. The sun was just beginning to dip behind the peaks, casting long shadows across the forest floor when I finally arrived at the parking area. It was empty except for one old camper van parked far away. I unloaded my gear, feeling a mix of excitement and relief. Setting up the tent was straightforward, the ground firm and mostly level, though covered in a layer of pine needles that smelled faintly of sap and decay. By the time I finished, the sky was a deep orange, and the first stars were appearing. I lit a small campfire and sat back, enjoying the warmth and the quiet. The only sounds were the rustle of leaves in the wind and the distant cry of some bird I couldn't identify. I cooked a simple dinner, canned beans with some rice, and as I ate, I started to notice the silence more. Not the peaceful kind of silence, but a dense, heavy one. The forest didn't hum or chatter. It was still in a way that felt unnatural. I shrugged it off. I had always been a bit paranoid in the woods, imagining things that weren't there. After cleaning up, I crawled into my sleeping bag, leaving the small fire smoldering. I wanted to get up early to explore the trails around the lake. The first night was cool, but not freezing. I fell asleep listening to the occasional snap of a twig in the distance. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of something moving outside the tent. At first, I thought it was an animal. Small creatures rustle all the time in the forest. Raccoons, deer, even the occasional fox. But the sound was different. It was deliberate, heavier, and it came in short bursts, like someone stepping carefully but with purpose. I froze, my heart beating fast, listening. The sound circled the tent slowly, stopping at intervals. I didn't move, hoping it was nothing more than a large animal investigating the smell of my food. But then I heard a low thud, like a heavy boot hitting the ground, and a soft scraping sound, as if something metallic was being dragged across the dirt. Fear gripped me. My first instinct was to reach for my phone, but I realized I had left it charging in the car. I told myself I was imagining it. Maybe a tree branch falling or an animal knocking over a log. But the more I listened, the more I realized it was something else entirely. The thuds were uneven, slow, and deliberate. They circled the tent at least 3 times. I could hear breathing, or maybe it was my own echoing in the stillness. I tried to stay calm, thinking I should make a noise, but I was paralyzed, every instinct screaming to hide. The sounds stopped abruptly. Silence swallowed the forest again. I waited, holding my breath, straining my ears. Then, just as I began to think I had imagined it, I heard a whisper of movement at the edge of the firelight. Shadows stretched unnaturally, and something or someone was crouched near my fire. My eyes strained to see, but the dark had an almost tangible thickness that made shapes shift and flicker. I could make out a figure, tall, hunched, and still. Panic took over. I grabbed the small pocket knife I always carried in my bag and unzipped the tent a few inches, careful not to let my silhouette show. The figure was gone. I blinked, and the firelight revealed only the forest floor and a few fallen branches. My heart was racing, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the knife. I told myself I had to stay calm. If it was just an animal, it would leave, and if it wasn't, I needed to be ready. I crawled back into the sleeping bag, keeping the knife in my hand and listening. Hours passed. I never fully slept. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jerk awake. Dawn came slowly, washing the forest in gray light. I peeked outside the tent and, for a moment, everything seemed normal. The small fire had died to ash, the morning mist hovered between the trees, and the forest appeared empty. I stepped outside cautiously, scanning the area. That's when I saw them. Footprints. They were large, heavy, and not human. The prints circled my campsite, then veered off toward the lake. Some were too large to be any ordinary animal. Others looked like boots but were irregular, as if the person walking was limping or dragging something. I felt my stomach drop. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, all the while scanning the forest for movement. My usual caution was gone, replaced by a raw need to escape. As I walked toward the trailhead, I kept my knife out, my eyes constantly darting to shadows between trees. The forest that had seemed peaceful the night before now felt alive, watching me. About halfway down the trail, I saw the camper van from the parking lot. Relief washed over me, but it was fleeting. The van was empty. No driver, no sign anyone had been there recently. That's when I noticed more tracks alongside the trail, larger footprints pacing parallel to mine. Whoever or whatever had been at my campsite was still nearby. My pace quickened. I began to jog, trying not to trip on roots or loose rocks. The trail twisted and turned, and I kept expecting to see someone step out from behind a tree, but there was only forest. By the time I reached the main road, my legs were sore, my lungs burned, and my mind was a jumble of fear and relief. I kept moving, waving down a passing car. When it stopped, I collapsed inside, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I tried to explain what had happened. The driver looked alarmed but didn't press me for details. I just needed to get away from that place. The police were sympathetic but skeptical. They checked the area but found no signs of the footprints I described. They suggested it might have been a large animal or even a prank. I didn't argue. I didn't want to return. I just wanted to forget. Over the next weeks, I replayed the events in my mind. I couldn't explain the footprints or the deliberate circling of my tent. No animals in that area moved like that. No one lived nearby to play a prank. Whatever had been there had been patient, calculated, and observant. I never went back to that forest. I researched similar incidents and found a few reports of people disappearing in the same region, none fully explained. I realized then that I had been lucky. Whatever had been watching me that night, it could have waited for me to make one wrong move. Now, whenever I go camping, I always stick to well-traveled areas. I double-check my equipment, make sure I can call for help, and never underestimate the forest. The memory of that night, the heavy steps circling my tent, the shadows in the firelight, the prints in the morning mist, stays with me. It's a reminder that sometimes the scariest things aren't monsters or ghosts, but the ones that are very real and very patient. I tell people the story now as a warning. A camping trip can go wrong in ways you never imagine. Nature is unpredictable, and some dangers aren't animals you can see or weather you can prepare for. Sometimes the forest itself is quiet, watching, and waiting. And when you're alone, even the smallest hint of movement can feel like the most terrifying thing you've ever faced. I survived, but I came back changed. More cautious, more aware, and more aware that the world can be much bigger and stranger than I thought. Even today, when I look at a forest from a distance, I feel that same unease creeping in, and I remember the night I almost became another story no one could explain. That memory, sharp and detailed, keeps me alive and keeps me careful. I had been planning this camping trip for months. I wanted to get away from the city, away from the constant noise, the traffic, the bright lights, the endless demands of work, and just breathe. I packed carefully, making sure I had everything I could possibly need. A heavy-duty tent, a sleeping bag rated for low temperatures, a portable stove, extra fuel, a large supply of food and water, a first aid kit, a multi-tool, a flashlight with extra batteries, and even a small emergency flare. I left with a feeling of anticipation, knowing that I would be alone in the wilderness, and hoping for solitude, fresh air, and a break from everything. The drive to the trailhead was long. I had chosen a spot deep in the forest, miles from the nearest town, with no cell signal for almost all of the area. The last 10 miles were rough, a gravel road that seemed to never end, twisting and turning between dense stands of trees, rising and falling over the uneven terrain. When I finally reached the parking area, I felt a small thrill of excitement. There were no other cars there, not a single person in sight. I pulled my gear out, loaded my backpack, and started the hike. The trail was narrow, overgrown in places, and completely silent except for the occasional bird, the rustle of leaves, and my own footsteps. The air was damp and smelled like pine and earth. My legs ached after the first hour, but I kept going, moving deeper into the forest. Sunlight filtered down through the tall trees, casting long, slanted shadows across the trail. I felt a sense of calm mixed with tension, the kind that comes from being completely alone in a place that doesn't see people very often. I reminded myself constantly to stay alert, knowing that being unprepared in the wilderness could be dangerous. By the time I reached the spot I had chosen to camp, the sun was already low in the sky. It was a small clearing beside a creek, the ground soft and flat, perfect for a tent. I set up my tent carefully, checking each stake, making sure the fly was taut, and testing the zippers. I collected some firewood, small branches, and dry pieces of wood from the surrounding area, enough to keep a fire going through the night. The forest around me seemed peaceful, yet I felt the first hints of unease creeping in. A subtle, almost instinctual awareness that I was completely exposed, that I could be alone with anything that moved through these trees. I started a small fire, the flames crackling and sending warm light into the cooling air. I cooked a simple dinner, something that didn't require too much attention, and ate slowly, listening to the sounds of the forest. It wasn't until the sun disappeared entirely that I noticed how quiet everything had become. The birds had gone, and even the wind seemed to have stopped. The only sound was the creek, a low gurgle over the rocks, and my own breathing. The darkness pressed in, heavier than I expected. Shadows from the fire danced on the trees, long and distorted, making every movement outside the small circle of light seem ominous. As I lay in my sleeping bag, trying to read a book by flashlight, I heard the first noise that made my stomach tighten. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible. A snapping branch somewhere beyond the firelight. I froze, listening. Another snap, this time closer. My heart started to race. I reminded myself that it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. I had no reason to fear anything larger. Predators in this area were rare, and I was aware of bears and cougars and had taken precautions, including carrying bear spray. But still, the noises continued. They didn't follow any pattern, moving slowly around the perimeter of my campsite, breaking branches and rustling leaves. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the darkness beyond the firelight. There was nothing I could see. I shone the beam across the clearing, along the creek, up into the trees, but the forest swallowed the light almost instantly. My mind started to race. I thought about the possibility of a human presence, someone wandering through the woods. It seemed unlikely, but the thought brought a real chill. I checked my small multi-tool and kept it by my side. The night stretched on, every sound amplified. The snapping, the rustling, the occasional thump that I could not identify. My imagination ran wild. I kept imagining eyes reflecting the firelight, shadowy shapes moving just beyond my vision. I tried to focus on breathing, on the sound of the creek, reminding myself that fear makes you see things that aren't there. but every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves, made my heart jump. Around midnight, the noises grew bolder. Something was moving closer. I could hear deliberate steps over the undergrowth, crunching twigs in a pattern that made it sound purposeful. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the sound, sweeping it slowly in every direction. Nothing. Then I realized that the sound was circling me, moving from one side of the clearing to the other. The logical part of my brain said it must be a large animal, maybe a deer or a wild boar, but my gut told me it could be something else. I decided to stay as quiet as possible, hoping that whatever it was would move on. I tightened the sleeping bag around me, keeping my breathing shallow, listening to every sound. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. I wanted to leave the tent, to run to my car, to escape the forest, but I knew that moving in the dark could be dangerous. There were roots and rocks everywhere, and if I stumbled, I could hurt myself, leaving me vulnerable. Finally, after what felt like endless circling, the noise stopped. I waited for several minutes before daring to move. I unzipped the tent slightly and peeked outside. The fire had burned down to embers, giving off just enough light to show the forest around me. The shadows were still there, thick and oppressive, but there was no movement. I exhaled slowly, feeling a tiny sense of relief. I spent the next few hours in a state of tense alertness. Every sound made me flinch, but nothing approached. When the first light of dawn started filtering through the trees, I ventured out to inspect the area. I found tracks in the soft earth, large, deep footprints that I didn't recognize immediately. They weren't deer or bear tracks. Their shape was unusual, elongated, and they seemed to lead in and out of the clearing. I realized with a growing sense of dread that someone, or something, had been walking around my campsite while I slept. The thought made my stomach twist, but I also knew that panic wouldn't help. I packed up quickly, leaving nothing behind that might attract attention. The hike back to the car was slow. I kept scanning the trees, aware of every movement, every sound. My legs burned, and my back ached, but adrenaline kept me moving. Every shadow seemed to stretch unnaturally. Every tree looked like it might be hiding someone. I stayed on the trail, refusing to take any shortcuts, refusing to look away from the path ahead. When I finally reached the car, I felt a mixture of relief and lingering fear. I checked the parking area carefully, circling the car before opening the door. Everything was empty. I locked the doors and sat inside for a few minutes, letting the tension drain from my body. I could still feel my heart racing, but I knew I had made it through the night without incident. As I drove back down the gravel road, I realized how important preparation and awareness had been. My gear had been sufficient. My fire had given me light and warmth. My backpack had contained all the necessities, and my patience and caution had kept me safe. I knew that I had faced real danger, something unpredictable and mysterious, but I also knew that staying calm and alert had made all the difference. By the time I reached the main highway and caught a cell signal, I called my friend to let them know I was safe. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by exhaustion. I thought about the night, about the sounds and shadows, and about the tracks in the dirt. I didn't know what had circled my campsite, and I still felt a chill thinking about it. But I also felt pride and relief. I had faced the fear of complete isolation and emerged unscathed. I made a silent promise to myself that I would be more cautious in the future, that I would never underestimate the wilderness, and that I would always respect the unpredictability of being alone in the forest. By the time I reached my apartment in the city, I was physically and mentally drained. I unpacked slowly, checking each piece of equipment for damage or signs of tampering. Everything was fine. I showered, washed off the dirt and sweat of the trail, and sat quietly, reflecting on the experience. The fear I had felt was real, but it was balanced by a sense of accomplishment. I had faced something unknown, something potentially dangerous, and I had survived. In the following days, I researched the tracks I had seen. Nothing matched perfectly, which only heightened my sense of mystery. Local wildlife experts suggested it could have been a large dog or wolf, but nothing was certain. I realized that part of the lesson was learning to coexist with the unknown. The wilderness doesn't cater to human schedules or expectations. It moves according to its own rules, and sometimes that means you encounter things you cannot explain. I returned to that forest several months later, better prepared and with a partner this time, for safety and reassurance. The experience was different, calmer, less frightening, but the memory of that night stayed with me. It reminded me that fear can be a tool, keeping you alert, focused, and alive. It reminded me that planning, awareness, and respect for the natural world are not optional. Most of all, it reminded me that you can survive something terrifying without panic, without luck, purely through preparation and clear thinking. That first night alone in the forest, though frightening and uncertain, became one of the most vivid experiences of my life. I had faced the unknown and emerged stronger, wiser, and more attuned to the subtle dangers of the natural world. And even though I never discovered exactly what had circled my campsite, I knew I had done everything possible to protect myself. I had trusted my instincts, relied on my preparation, and stayed calm in the face of fear. That, more than anything else, made the ending not just good, but clear, complete, and empowering. I had been planning this solo camping trip for months. I wanted a weekend away from everything. The noise, the people, the constant pressure of work and life. I needed silence, isolation, and the kind of deep, undisturbed quiet that only exists when you are completely alone in the wilderness. I packed everything meticulously, checking and rechecking my backpack to make sure I had enough food, water, and survival gear. I had my tent, sleeping bag, a small stove, a first aid kit, plenty of batteries, a headlamp, and a sturdy knife. I even brought an extra rope and some basic tools. I knew the area I planned to camp in was remote, deep in the forest, a place people went hiking but few stayed overnight. I liked that. I arrived just after noon. The weather was clear, slightly cool with a light breeze that moved through the tall pines in the forest. The sunlight filtered through the branches, creating uneven patterns on the forest floor. The smell of pine and damp earth was strong and immediate. It felt like stepping into a different world. I carried my backpack along the narrow dirt path, my boots crunching over dried leaves and twigs. Birds called occasionally from high up in the trees, and I could hear the faint hum of insects hidden in the undergrowth. I kept walking deeper into the forest, following the path that led to a small clearing I had discovered on a map. The clearing was perfect. It was surrounded by thick trees on all sides, giving a sense of privacy and isolation. The ground was relatively flat, covered in soft moss and small patches of grass, with a few large rocks scattered around. I set my backpack down and immediately began to unpack. First, the tent. I inspected the tent carefully, making sure all the poles were in place and the fabric wasn't torn. Once it was up, I laid out my sleeping bag and organized my small camp area. I gathered some dry wood from the surrounding area to make a fire later, carefully avoiding any damp or rotten pieces. By late afternoon, I was ready. The forest had started to take on that soft, golden light that comes just before sunset. I decided to take a short walk to explore a little, just to stretch my legs and see what the area had to offer. I stayed close to the clearing, moving carefully over roots and uneven ground. I noticed animal tracks in the dirt, small deer prints, maybe a raccoon or two. The forest felt alive, but in a quiet way, as if it was observing me as much as I was observing it. I kept moving slowly, watching for anything unusual, but everything seemed normal. When I returned to the clearing, the sun had dipped lower, and the shadows had grown long. I started my fire carefully, arranging the wood into a small stack and using kindling to get it burning. The firelight created a warm glow, contrasting with the growing darkness around me. I cooked a simple meal of rice and canned vegetables on my small stove and ate slowly, enjoying the warmth and the smell of the fire. Once I was done, I cleaned up, making sure to pack away anything that could attract animals. Bears were rare in this area, but it was always better to be safe. I stored my food in a backpack and hung it from a tree branch some distance away from the tent. Night fell quickly. The sky was clear, and 1,000 stars appeared above me, brighter than I had ever seen in the city. The forest around me became a different place, familiar yet strange. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig felt louder and sharper in the dark. I tried to focus on my fire, but even that small glow only illuminated a tiny area, leaving the surrounding trees in darkness. I felt a slight unease creeping in, but I told myself it was normal. The wilderness was not a quiet place at night. Every sound was magnified, every shadow seemed to move. I double-checked my knife and made sure my headlamp was working. I had a plan. If anything went wrong, I would be ready. As I settled into my sleeping bag, the noises of the forest seemed to grow louder. The wind rustled the treetops, and I could hear small animals moving through the underbrush. Occasionally, I thought I heard something larger moving, but it always stopped when I listened carefully. I reminded myself that in the forest, shadows can trick your eyes and wind can create strange noises. I tried to relax, but sleep didn't come easily. My mind kept turning over the sounds, imagining scenarios. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a light sleep. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke abruptly. I had felt a vibration through the ground, subtle but distinct. My heart rate increased immediately. I stayed perfectly still, straining to listen. The forest was quiet again, but there was a tension, a sense of something moving. I carefully reached for my headlamp, clicking it on without making too much noise. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the clearing. Everything looked normal. I kept my breathing steady and listened again. Then I heard it, a low, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the ground. I froze, trying to figure out what it could be. It wasn't the wind or a normal animal. It was slow, deliberate. My mind raced. I had planned for bears or mountain lions, but this was different. The sound continued, moving around the edge of the clearing. I stayed as quiet as possible, thinking through my options. The first instinct was to grab my knife, but I also knew staying hidden might be safer. I slowly unzipped the tent slightly, careful to keep the fabric close around me. The dragging sound was louder now, closer. My eyes searched the darkness outside the tent, the headlamp beam cutting through shadows but revealing nothing. I realized I could be dealing with a human intruder. The forest was isolated, but not entirely unreachable. People sometimes ventured off trails for camping or worse. My mind considered all the possibilities: an animal attack, a hiker gone wrong, someone intent on causing harm. The sound stopped for a moment, then began again, closer this time. I could hear footsteps on leaves and twigs. They weren't quick. They were slow, deliberate, heavy. I had no choice but to act. I grabbed my backpack quietly, making sure my knife was within reach. I had to leave, but the forest around me was dark, and I didn't want to alert anyone outside the clearing if they were dangerous. I waited for another moment, listening. Then I noticed a faint smell, smoke, but not from my fire. It was acrid, like burning rubber or plastic. My pulse quickened. I realized that someone could have a fire somewhere nearby, maybe not far from my location. I had no phone signal to call for help. I made a decision. I would leave immediately, moving carefully through the darkness, keeping my headlamp off unless absolutely necessary. I slipped out of the tent, crouched low, and moved toward a denser part of the forest I had noticed during the day. The ground was uneven, roots and rocks threatening to trip me, but I forced myself to keep moving quietly. I heard movement behind me again, not far away. I froze, trying to catch any hint of direction. I could hear someone or something following slowly, carefully. My stomach tightened. I had to get away. I remembered a stream I had crossed earlier in the day. Water could help mask my movements and provide a path I could follow back to the main trail. I ran quietly, sticking to the shadows, using trees and rocks for cover. The dragging sound came again, closer. I realized that if the person or animal found me in the open, I would be in real danger. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the stream. The sound of water rushing over rocks was louder than any other sound in the forest. I followed it, moving carefully through slippery stones, keeping my balance. The dragging or shuffling behind me seemed to hesitate at the edge of the stream, then retreat slightly. I didn't look back, but I could feel eyes or at least attention on me. I I kept moving, following the stream until I reached a small embankment that led up toward the main trail I had walked on earlier. My legs burned, my breathing was heavy, but I didn't stop. I had no idea if the person or animal was still following me. Finally, after an hour of careful movement, I reached the trail. The moonlight illuminated it enough that I could see the dirt path clearly. I ran along it until I reached my car, parked at the trailhead. I unlocked the door, got in, and locked it behind me. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I stayed inside for a few minutes, listening, making sure I wasn't being followed. Then, cautiously, I drove away, keeping my eyes on the dark forest around me. I didn't know exactly what had been out there, but I was alive and I had escaped. When I got home, I unpacked slowly, checking every piece of equipment, every rope and knife. I realized that the trip had been a wake-up call about how careful you have to be when you are alone in the wilderness. I filed a report with the local ranger station, describing what had happened as accurately as possible. They investigated the area and found signs of recent human activity. A small campfire, footprints, and some broken branches, but no one was caught. In the days following, I reflected on the experience. I realized how vulnerable I had been, even with planning and preparation. I also felt an immense sense of relief and accomplishment. I had survived, and I had learned to trust my instincts. The forest was beautiful and terrifying and unpredictable, but I had made it out. I now carry a deeper respect for the wilderness and the people who move through it, unseen and unknown. That night changed me, made me more cautious, but also stronger in ways I didn't expect. The memory of that dragging sound, the hidden presence stalking the clearing, stayed with me for a long time, but it also reminded me that careful preparation, awareness, and calm thinking can mean the difference between life and death. I returned to camping later, but never to that clearing, never alone at night. I learned to trust my senses, to anticipate danger, and to always respect the wild, unpredictable world around me. The experience was terrifying, yes, but it ended clearly. I survived, I learned, and I grew more capable and aware. That clarity, that survival became my ultimate reward. I had been planning this camping trip for months. The idea was simple: escape the city, breathe some fresh air, and spend a few nights alone in the wilderness. I had spent days researching trails, checking maps, looking at weather reports, and reading reviews from other campers. I wanted a place that was remote but not dangerous, somewhere I could hike, set up a tent, maybe even fish in a quiet stream. When I finally chose a trail that led deep into a national forest, I felt confident. It was early September, and the weather was supposed to be mild. The forest was known for its dense trees, a few creeks, and scattered camping clearings. I packed my backpack carefully, making sure I had food, water, a first aid kit, a flashlight, extra batteries, a small camping stove, and my sleeping bag. I also carried a small hatchet and a multi-tool just in case. Everything fit snugly, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could truly escape. The drive to the trailhead was long but quiet. The roads narrowed as I left the city behind, eventually turning into rough gravel paths that wound through the forest. By the time I parked my car, the sun was already low in the sky, casting long shadows between the trees. I double-checked my map, locked the car, and hoisted my backpack over my shoulders. The trail started easily, a well-worn path with soft dirt and fallen leaves underfoot. I walked at a steady pace, enjoying the crisp air and the faint smell of pine. Every now and then, I could hear birds singing or the distant rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. The forest felt alive, and yet, in a quiet way, it also felt empty. There were no other hikers in sight. No sounds of engines, voices, or dogs barking. Just the forest itself. I hiked for hours, my legs growing tired but my excitement building. I wanted to find the perfect camping spot before nightfall, somewhere near water but still tucked away under the trees. Around mid-afternoon, I came across a small clearing near a creek. The ground was flat, shaded by tall oaks and pines, and there were plenty of fallen branches I could use for a fire. I dropped my backpack and took a moment to catch my breath. The creek babbled softly nearby, and I could see fish darting beneath the clear water. It seemed perfect. I spent the next hour setting up my tent, making sure the rainfly was secure and staking it into the ground. I arranged my sleeping bag neatly inside, laid out a small tarp for my gear, and set up a fire ring using stones from the creek bed. I was proud of how efficiently I had managed everything and felt ready to relax. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I started a small fire. I cooked a simple dinner of instant rice and canned beans, savoring the warmth and the quiet. The forest around me grew darker, the shadows deepening until they seemed to swallow the clearing. The creek's gentle babble was the only sound, apart from the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I felt a sense of satisfaction as I cleaned up, stored my food in a bear-proof container, and crawled into my sleeping bag. The fire burned low, and the air had cooled considerably. I had my flashlight and extra batteries nearby, just in case, and for a while everything felt fine. Around midnight, I woke to a strange sound. It was faint at first, almost like footsteps crunching on leaves, but I quickly realized it wasn't consistent with any animal I knew. It sounded deliberate, slow, and careful, moving around the edge of the clearing. I froze, listening, trying to tell if it was close or far. My heart started pounding, and I realized I had no phone signal and no one else around. I debated what to do. I could stay in my tent, quietly hope whatever it was moved on, or I could grab my flashlight and try to see it. My instincts told me to stay low, so I stayed inside the tent, clutching my hatchet. The sound continued for several minutes, moving closer, then retreating, then circling the clearing. I could hear the faint snap of a branch breaking underfoot. My stomach tightened. It was impossible to tell whether it was a wild animal or a human, but whatever it was big enough to make these noises and deliberate enough to be aware of me. I stayed awake for what felt like hours, listening. Every now and then, I heard something move. More leaves rustling, more branches snapping. My flashlight lay within reach, but I resisted the urge to peek outside. I kept telling myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon, but rational thought didn't calm the fear that had settled deep in my chest. Eventually, exhaustion overcame me, and I drifted into a light sleep, waking every time a new sound made my ears prick. I kept my hatchet in my lap and my flashlight within reach, tense and alert. The next morning, I awoke to silence. The forest looked calm, the creek running clear, sunlight filtering through the leaves. I felt relief wash over me, but I also noticed something unsettling. Small footprints in the mud near my tent. They were not human but large, round, and looked like some kind of heavy boot. My heart sank as I realized the sounds from last night were not imaginary. Whoever or whatever had been circling me had left evidence. I examined the prints carefully and noticed they were too large and heavy to be a typical hiker. Panic mixed with a sense of urgency. I packed my tent and gear quickly, trying to make as little noise as possible. I didn't know if the intruder was still nearby, but I didn't want to wait to find out. I decided to follow the trail back toward the main road, hoping to get out of the forest before anything else happened. My pace was fast, almost a jog, but the trail was uneven and full of roots and loose rocks. I had to concentrate on each step, listening for any new sounds. Occasionally, I would stop and look around, scanning the shadows between the trees. Nothing, but I knew I wasn't safe yet. Every snapping twig made my heart race. I realized that if someone had been around my campsite, they could be anywhere on the trail as well. The fear of being followed made my muscles tense, my breathing shallow. I was hyper-aware of everything. The sound of birds, the wind moving through the trees, even the faint smell of smoke that might have been from a distant campfire. I couldn't trust anything. As I moved deeper into the trail, I noticed signs of recent human presence. Discarded wrappers, a flattened patch of ground where a tent had been set up, footprints in soft soil. It confirmed my fear. People had been here recently, and not necessarily for camping in a normal way. The thought made me uneasy. I considered climbing a tree to get a better view or hiding until morning, but I had no idea how long I would have to wait and no guarantee that would help. I pressed on, hoping that by putting more distance between myself and the clearing, I would eventually be safe. Around midday, I reached a fork in the trail. I pulled out my map and realized that one path led toward a small ranger station about 6 miles away, while the other looped deeper into the forest. I took the path to the ranger station. Every step felt heavy, and the fear in the back of my mind didn't let up. I kept imagining movement in the trees, shadows shifting, and the sound of footsteps behind me. At one point, I thought I saw someone crouching behind a tree, but when I focused, there was nothing there. The uncertainty was worse than any real threat because I couldn't tell what was real and what was my imagination amplifying the fear. By late afternoon, I spotted the ranger station in the distance. Relief hit me in waves. I was tired, sore, and on edge, but I had made it this far. When I arrived, the station was open, and I found a ranger inside. I explained what had happened, showing the footprints near my campsite and recounting the sounds I had heard. The ranger nodded and took notes, warning me that the area had recently been visited by poachers who were known to stalk trails and campsites. They sometimes hid and observed campers, and occasionally they could become dangerous if surprised or threatened. My stomach sank. I realized how close I had been to a real human threat. The ranger offered to escort me back to my car, which I gratefully accepted. As we hiked together, I felt a strange mixture of relief and lingering fear, realizing that the forest I had thought was peaceful could suddenly feel menacing. When I finally reached my car, parked at the trailhead, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the gravel path. I locked the doors behind me and sank into the seat, exhausted. I could still feel the tension in my muscles, and my mind kept replaying the night's events. I sat there for a long time, just breathing, trying to shake the lingering fear. Slowly, the forest felt like it had released me, at least temporarily. I knew I would never forget those sounds circling my tent, the weight of the unseen presence, and the realization that danger in the wilderness was not always natural. It could be human too. In the days after, I made several changes to how I approached camping. I researched safer, more populated sites, learned more about wilderness safety regarding other people, and made a habit of informing someone of my location in detail. The experience taught me that even the most carefully planned trips could go wrong, and that caution was never unnecessary. I returned to the forest later, but I never went back to that particular clearing. The memory of the prints in the mud, the night spent listening to something moving just beyond the tent, and the overwhelming feeling of being watched stayed with me. It was a harsh lesson, but one that ultimately made me more careful, more aware, and more respectful of the wilderness and the unseen dangers that could exist there. The forest was still beautiful, still peaceful in many ways, but it was also real and unpredictable, and I had learned firsthand that some of the scariest experiences were the ones where human intent, rather than fantasy, created the threat. I had always loved the idea of camping alone. There was a quiet thrill in it, a sense of freedom and control that I rarely felt in my day-to-day life. I liked the solitude, the chance to wake up to the forest instead of an alarm clock, to hear nothing but wind through the trees and birds somewhere far above. That summer, I decided to take a trip into a section of the mountains I had never visited before, a trail that promised remoteness and a lake for fishing. I packed carefully, making sure I had enough water, food, and the tools I thought I might need. My bag weighed more than I liked, but I reassured myself that it was necessary. I left my phone on airplane mode to save battery, intending to use it only for emergencies. The trail started easy enough. The first few hours were nothing but walking through the dense forest, sunlight cutting through the leaves, and the smell of pine thick in the air. I moved slowly, keeping an eye on the ground for roots or rocks, and listening. I had heard stories from other hikers about how quickly a seemingly safe forest could turn dangerous, about animals, weather, and even other people who might not have good intentions. That thought lingered at the back of my mind, but I pushed it away, focusing on my breathing, the rhythm of my steps, and the distant call of a bird I couldn't see. By mid-afternoon, the trail grew steeper. Loose rocks and tree roots made footing difficult. My legs ached, and my shirt stuck to my back from sweat. The sun was lower now, filtering golden light through the trees. I knew I wouldn't make it to the lake that day, so I began looking for a place to camp. I found a small clearing just off the trail, surrounded by thick undergrowth and backed by a rise in the land that would shelter me from wind. The ground was uneven, littered with twigs and small stones, but I cleared a space large enough for my tent. I set up camp slowly, taking care to secure the tent properly. I wanted to be sure it would withstand the night because I had read too many survival blogs to take anything for granted. I collected firewood, arranging small sticks and larger logs in a neat pile for later. Then I rested a bit, sitting against a tree with my water bottle in hand, listening to the forest settle as the sun sank lower. Shadows grew longer, the wind whispered through the branches, and I felt a sense of unease settle over me. Not fear, exactly, but a nervous awareness that I was alone, that nothing around me was controlled by me. Night came faster than I expected. The forest changed as darkness fell, and even with my headlamp, I could see very little. The sounds changed too. At first, there was the usual chorus of insects and the occasional rustle of a small animal. But then came noises that made me pause, branches snapping, leaves rustling closer than they should have been. A heavy footfall that didn't sound like any animal I knew. My stomach tightened. I kept my fire small at first, just enough light to see the ground around me. I could feel my heart beating faster, but I told myself it was normal. Animals were active at night. Then I heard it again, louder this time, a deliberate step that sounded close to my tent. I froze, holding my breath, straining to hear. The wind shifted, and for a moment I thought I saw a shape move between the trees. My first thought was a bear, and I reached for my bear spray instinctively, remembering all the warnings I had read. I had no weapon besides that, and I wasn't sure it would be enough, but it was something. I stayed very still, waiting. Nothing happened for what felt like forever. The forest seemed to hold its breath with me. Eventually, the sound stopped. I told myself it had probably been a deer or some other animal. I tried to calm down, but sleep didn't come. Every small noise made me tense. A gust of wind made the tent flap against the pole, and I almost jumped out of my skin. I kept my flashlight close and my bear spray even closer. Hours passed in that state, the tension never letting me relax. At some point, I dozed lightly, only to be jolted awake by a louder sound. This time it wasn't outside. It was underneath my tent, a scraping sound against the ground. My mind raced. I had no idea what could make that sound, and I couldn't see anything beneath the tent. I realized then how unprepared I had been for total isolation. I had assumed solitude would be peaceful, but it could also be terrifying when the only thing between safety and danger was a thin layer of nylon. I thought about packing up and hiking back, but the idea of walking the trail in darkness seemed even more dangerous. My best option was to stay put, keep my fire alive, and wait for first light. The night dragged on. The noises never fully went away, occasional branches snapping, the soft thud of something moving. I imagined every possibility. A large animal, another human, something else entirely. My mind jumped from one scenario to another, each one more frightening than the last. I kept my flashlight ready, my pack within reach, and my ears straining for any change in the pattern of sounds. By the time first light came, I was exhausted. My muscles ached, my eyes were sore, and my mind felt raw from hours of tension. The forest looked calm again, bathed in soft morning light, and I realized I had survived the night. I carefully peeked outside the tent. Nothing unusual. No large footprints, no evidence of anyone or anything having approached my camp. I packed slowly, every movement deliberate, checking the perimeter. I left no trace, nothing that would indicate where I had slept. The hike out was tense as well. Every sound seemed amplified, the crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves. But as I gained distance from that spot, my confidence returned slowly. By the time I reached the main trailhead, I felt a mixture of relief and accomplishment. I had gone through a night that tested my nerves and my judgment, and I had survived using caution and careful thinking. Once back in my car, I sat for a long time before starting the engine. I thought about what had happened, about how quickly a situation could become dangerous when alone in the wilderness. I realized that fear was a natural part of isolation, but preparedness and vigilance were what made the difference between panic and survival. I vowed to never take solitude for granted again, to respect the forest in a way I hadn't before, and to always carry enough tools and knowledge to handle unexpected situations. Looking back, the experience changed me. I understood the value of caution, the importance of respecting the environment, and the need to be mentally and physically ready for anything. I had gone seeking adventure and peace, and I had found fear, but I had also found resilience. The forest had tested me, and I had met the test. The memory of that night stayed with me, a quiet reminder that the line between safety and danger can be thin, and that survival depends on awareness, preparation, and keeping calm when everything around you is uncertain. I had been planning this solo camping trip for months. The idea of spending a weekend deep in the wilderness, away from people, phones, and schedules, had a strong pull on me. I had my backpack loaded with everything I thought I might need: a tent, sleeping bag, portable stove, extra food and water, first aid kit, a headlamp with spare batteries, a knife, and a map. I had researched the area thoroughly. Dense forests, winding trails, a few streams, but I had never gone this deep before. Most of the guides I read warned about keeping an eye out for bears and other wildlife, making sure I knew how to start a fire, and staying aware of the weather. I considered myself prepared. I started my hike early in the morning. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that filled your lungs and made you feel alive. Birds chirped faintly, and somewhere in the distance, a stream ran over rocks, the sound carrying through the trees. The trail was muddy from a recent rain, and every few steps, my boots sank into soft earth. The forest was alive with small movements: squirrels darting from tree to tree, a deer leaping across a clearing, the occasional flutter of wings from a hidden bird. I felt a sense of solitude that was both peaceful and unnerving. Alone in the woods, every sound seemed amplified, every rustle of leaves potentially meaningful. By mid-afternoon, I had hiked several miles and reached the area where I planned to set up camp. There was a small clearing beside a slow-moving creek, the sunlight cutting through the canopy in streaks that painted the ground gold. I set down my backpack and began unpacking. I chose a flat patch for my tent, checking for sharp stones or hidden roots that might poke through the floor. I hammered the stakes into the ground, listening to the rhythmic sound echo through the silence. After the tent was up, I gathered firewood from the nearby forest, breaking branches into smaller pieces. I wanted a fire big enough to last the night but manageable enough to keep safe. By the time the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the forest was changing. Shadows stretched long and the light dimmed, filtering through the trees in strange angles. I lit the fire and watched the flames flicker, feeling the warmth seep into my bones. I cooked a simple meal, instant noodles heated over the flames, and ate slowly, savoring the silence. It was the kind of calm I had been craving. For a while, everything felt perfect. Then I noticed it, a movement near the edge of the clearing. At first, I thought it was just a deer or some small animal, but it didn't look right. The movement was too deliberate, too controlled, almost like it was watching me. My stomach dropped. I scanned the perimeter with the flashlight, its beam cutting through the growing darkness. There was nothing. I told myself it was probably my imagination, the forest playing tricks on me as the light faded. I brushed it off, retreating into the tent as the fire burned lower. The first few hours of night were quiet. The crackling fire, the distant sound of water, and the occasional rustle of leaves formed a strange symphony of wilderness noises. I fell asleep feeling cautious but reassured by the firelight. Around midnight, I woke to a faint noise outside the tent. A snapping of twigs, something soft crunching over dead leaves. My heart raced. I stayed perfectly still, listening. The sound came closer, circling the tent, stopping, then moving away. Whoever or whatever it wasn't just passing by. It was lingering, testing boundaries. I didn't have a weapon ready, just my small pocket knife, and I didn't want to provoke anything. I remembered all the warnings from the guides. Make yourself visible. Make noise if approached by a large predator. Don't run blindly. I reached for my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent a little, careful not to let the zipper squeak. The beam sliced through the dark. I saw movement. Figures, maybe human, crouched low and moving silently through the trees. My chest tightened. The firelight was too weak to illuminate the entire clearing, but I could see shadows moving with intent. I realized then how vulnerable I truly was. How alone. Hours passed. I stayed as quiet as possible, listening. The wind picked up, rustling the treetops and masking other sounds. Eventually, the forest grew still again, almost unnaturally so. When dawn broke, I cautiously unzipped the tent and peered outside. There were no footprints I could make out, no signs of disturbance beyond broken branches near the far edge of the clearing. I packed up quickly, my hands shaking, and started hiking back toward the main trail. I kept my eyes open, every sense alert. The forest felt different in the daylight, less oppressive, but still heavy with tension. On the way back, I realized how easily I could have been trapped or followed. The forest was dense, and there were countless places to hide, to ambush. I thought about how unprepared I had been for someone or something watching me. I stuck to the trail, keeping my pace steady, checking behind me often. My mind replayed the night over and over, each time the shadowy figures feeling more real, more deliberate. After several hours, I finally emerged near the parking area. The safety of other people, cars, and the open road was a relief I had never imagined before the trip. I called someone to let them know I had made it out. The feeling of being alive, fully present in every nerve and muscle, washed over me. That night, at home, I couldn't stop thinking about how easy it would have been for things to go wrong. I made notes for my next trip. Never camp alone in a remote area. Always have a way to signal for help. Trust instincts when something feels off. Weeks later, I returned to the forest, but not to the same campsite. I stayed in areas where people were around, near maintained trails. I took the same precautions, but the paranoia I felt on that first trip never fully left me. I became more meticulous with preparation, more cautious about the unexpected. The forest was beautiful, the streams sparkling, the wildlife vibrant, but it was also alive in ways I had underestimated. And I had learned the hard way that being alone in the dark, even with all your gear, was a gamble. I didn't feel foolish anymore. I felt alive and wary and careful, and that awareness, I realized, was worth far more than any sense of adventure. I had been planning the camping trip for months, obsessively checking maps, weather reports, and even old hiking logs from other travelers. I wanted isolation, a real escape from the constant noise of life in the city. The area I chose was deep in the northern forests, a place where few ventured, marked by dense pines and narrow, uneven trails that wound through hills and rocky creeks. I packed everything meticulously: tent, sleeping bag, stove, food, water purification tablets, first aid kit, extra layers of clothing, and a small but sharp survival knife. I even included a couple of books, though I knew I wouldn't read much once I was there. The feeling of being completely alone in the forest, surrounded only by nature, was intoxicating to me, though I also felt a tension beneath the excitement, like I was teetering on the edge of something unknown. The hike to the campsite took longer than I expected. The trail was rougher than the maps suggested. Branches snagged my jacket, loose stones slid under my boots, and the uneven roots forced me to constantly look down. I moved slowly, not wanting to risk a sprained ankle in a place so far from help. By late afternoon, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. I finally found a small clearing by a creek, a perfect spot that was flat enough for my tent and still surrounded by trees for privacy. I set up the tent carefully, staking each corner firmly, and then gathered wood for a fire. The act of preparing for the night gave me a sense of control, though I could feel an undercurrent of unease, a faint awareness that something about being completely alone in this wilderness made me vulnerable in ways I hadn't fully appreciated. As night fell, the forest transformed. The temperature dropped rapidly, and the air became damp and cold. The creek gurgled quietly nearby, a soothing sound at first, but later it began to feel oppressive, as if it amplified the silence of the forest around me. I built a fire, small but steady, and huddled near it, eating a simple meal of canned beans and crackers. The isolation was profound. Even though I had heard the forest at night is alive with sounds, I initially felt calm, almost peaceful. Crickets chirped, leaves rustled with the occasional breeze, and the wind whispered through the trees. But after a while, those sounds began to feel different. Not threatening, exactly, but unsettling in their unpredictability. Every crack of a branch, every sudden rustle of leaves, made me glance over my shoulder, tense and alert. It wasn't until around midnight that the first real fear began to creep in. I had left the fire low to conserve wood, thinking I could sleep nearby with its warmth and light. Then I heard a sound that made my stomach tighten, a low growl coming from somewhere beyond the tree line. My immediate reaction was disbelief. Bears were known in the area, but I had assumed the nearest ones were miles away. I gripped my knife and slowly shined my flashlight toward the sound, but I saw nothing. The growl came again, closer this time, more distinct. I realized it wasn't continuous but deliberate, as if something was moving carefully toward me. My heart hammered in my chest, and for the first time, I felt the raw reality of being completely alone, utterly defenseless except for the small tools I had brought. I spent the next hour trying to stay calm. I kept the fire alive, adding small pieces of wood, listening carefully. The sounds of movement seemed to shift around me, circling at the edge of my vision. I considered climbing into the tent and staying inside until dawn, but I also knew that a bear or any wild animal could still attack a tent if it smelled food. The thought of being trapped, limited to the small space of my tent, while something prowled outside, was suffocating. I decided to stay near the fire, knife in hand, eyes scanning the darkness, muscles tensed for any movement. The growls grew louder, punctuated now by snaps and the occasional thud of something heavy moving through the underbrush. It wasn't just curiosity, it was testing the space around me. Every instinct screamed that I should leave, but leaving meant stumbling through the dark forest with only a weak flashlight, risking injury or worse. I had packed a whistle and I blew it briefly, hoping it would scare whatever it was away. But the sound only made the noises stop for a moment before resuming, closer, more deliberate. My hands shook, not just from the cold but from pure adrenaline. Every sound in the forest seemed amplified. The creak, the wind, even the beating of my own heart. Time stretched painfully, minutes feeling like hours. Then I heard it, a heavier crash, like something large had fallen over a fallen tree behind me. I spun slowly with the flashlight, catching a glimpse of a massive shadow slipping between the trees. I froze, realizing that the forest was no longer just the forest. It had become a labyrinth of shadows, a place where I was small, exposed, and alone. My mind raced. I knew bears can be dangerous, especially if they feel threatened or are protecting cubs, but I had no idea if this was a bear or something else. Fear mingled with rational thought. I needed to protect my food, keep the fire alive, and not provoke whatever it was. I gripped the knife tighter, prepared for an attack I hoped would never come. Hours passed in tense, agonizing silence. Every small noise made me jump. The fire burned low, forcing me to feed it sporadically. At some point, I realized the animal had retreated, but the sense of danger remained. Sleep was impossible. I stayed alert until the first light of dawn, watching the edge of the clearing for any movement. When sunlight finally filtered through the trees, it revealed nothing. No tracks, no broken branches, no sign of what had been there. The forest looked peaceful again, almost ordinary, but I knew it had held something dangerous just hours earlier. Exhausted but aware of the need to move, I packed my camp carefully, minimizing noise, and started down the trail. Every step felt cautious, calculated. I avoided the thick underbrush, staying on the path as much as possible. My thoughts were scattered, jumping between relief, fear, and self-recrimination for not leaving earlier. The isolation that had initially been alluring now felt like a trap. I remembered reading about survival strategies. Make yourself as big and loud as possible. Don't run. Keep sightlines clear. Be aware of wind direction to avoid carrying your scent. All of it seemed painfully theoretical in the cold light of morning, facing a real threat alone. By midday, I reached a wider trail used by occasional hikers and cyclists. I could see tire tracks, footprints, and signs of human activity, all of which brought a sense of relief. I began moving faster, almost jogging, eager to reach a ranger station or any sign of civilization. I kept glancing behind me, half expecting the shadowy figure of last night to reappear, but nothing came. My adrenaline began to fade slowly, replaced by exhaustion and lingering tension. Every noise, birds calling, leaves rustling, even my own breathing, was magnified in my mind. The forest had shifted from a place of adventure to a place of threat, a lesson in how quickly control and safety can slip away. When I finally reached the ranger station in the late afternoon, I collapsed in a chair, feeling the weight of fatigue and relief at the same time. I explained my situation briefly to the ranger, who nodded solemnly, understanding the dangers of the area. They confirmed that bears had been spotted in the region, and several hikers had reported unusual animal behavior over the past weeks. They offered advice on how to safely pack and store food and emphasized never camping alone without proper precautions. I listened, realizing that while I had survived the night, it had been a narrow escape. The sense of control I had felt in planning my trip had been an illusion. In nature, especially in complete isolation, survival depended on vigilance, respect, and a little luck. After leaving the ranger station, I resolved to take a safer route home. I stuck to established trails, avoided dense forest, and kept a constant watch for wildlife. The adrenaline slowly ebbed, replaced by exhaustion and reflection. I realized the trip had been more than a test of endurance. It had been a confrontation with vulnerability. I had romanticized solitude and the thrill of isolation, but I had encountered a reality far harsher and more immediate than I expected. By the time I reached my car, the sun was setting, casting long golden shadows across the forest. I sat there for a long while, breathing deeply, absorbing the quiet and the warmth of safety. I knew I would return to camping eventually, but never without proper preparation, never without respecting the unpredictable power of the wilderness. The forest had taught me a lesson in vigilance, patience, and humility, one that would stay with me long after I had left it behind. Even weeks later, the memory of that night haunted me in subtle ways. Every rustle in the backyard, every distant animal call, brought back the tense, vivid fear of being completely alone and exposed. But alongside that fear was a newfound respect for the wilderness, a recognition that nature is not forgiving, but it is fair. I survived because I paid attention, because I stayed calm under pressure, and because I respected the environment. That clarity, that understanding, gave me a sense of closure. I had entered the forest seeking adventure and emerged with knowledge, caution, and a deeper awareness of my own limits. The experience left me changed, not weaker, but wiser, and it reminded me that survival is not about heroics, but about presence, preparation, and patience.